Welcome to NewYorkBIOs Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Tanisha Carino, partner at Brunswick Group and senior corporate affairs and health policy expert.
Morning, Tanisha. We are so thrilled to have you here. And, one of the reasons this is great is you have done so many things in your career that hit on kind of all angles of things that we're kind of grappling with as an industry now. You've looked at public policy from large biopharma, from large biotech. So contrast GSK and Alexion in terms of the types of patients that they serve. We think about faster cures. We think about philanthropy. There are so many things for us to get into today. So with that, we tend to start with a bit of an origin story. So why don't you tell everybody how you got where you are today?
Thank you, Derek, and good morning from San Francisco. And thank you, Jennifer, for having me here. Almost a year ago, I was able to join you all in person. It was probably the first in-person event I had been to do a vision talk. And it was such a special occasion for me. And so thank you for letting me be on the show again. So my origin story is very much part of, I think, where what you see today. And much of it really starts from having been a caseworker for HIV Atlanta while I was an undergrad at Emory University, and really seeing the people that I was intaking, so the people that were first visiting Aid Atlanta, and hearing what it is that they were grappling with. And yes, they were HIV positive, but more importantly, they were worried about housing. They didn't know if they're going to remain employed. They didn't know what to do if they weren't employed in terms of an income. And all of those things for me at a very young age, I think I was 19 when I started working at Aid Atlanta, really shook my confidence that maybe medicine was not a path for me, and that there was another road ahead, which was in working on big systems issues. So, with that in mind, I've been devoted to this idea of person-centered care and systems for a long time. And for me, that's led me into working across three of the sectors that really have to work together to get it right, whether it's government or philanthropy or the for-profit sector. And each of those sectors has really unique roles that they each play that are unique in really trying to address the same set of problems.
Excellent. It's funny you hit on this because in so many ways it's a yes and problem, right? The patients have all sorts of things that they're dealing with from a health standpoint, and they have the rest of their lives to worry about, right? And I think a lot of times we get caught up in the sequelae of whatever disease we're talking about, but we don't always look at what that means in terms of how they get to a doctor's office, or literally how they pay rent, or how they do any of these things that help live just day to day, that I don't want to say we take them for granted, but they're normal things to us rather than things on top of healthcare issues that we have to think about.
Absolutely. And for me, right coming out of Aid Atlanta, the first stop really was the government. After Aid Atlanta, I went on to do my PhD at Johns Hopkins. My PhD was in health policy, but I also had the pleasure of actually working in government in Medicare while I was finishing my doctorate. And when you're in government, government service is always an honor to serve your country. When you're in the bowels of an agency, the way I was in my early 20s, it was a grind to wake up every morning and think about sort of what is our authority to make a decision on this particular case. But when you step away from, and for me, we were just at Medicare trying to figure out whether Medicare can assert its authority to say yes or no to the coverage of new technologies that were coming to market. Fast forward now 20 years, government has direct negotiation power. But back then, we were just then really thinking about what is this role we have when it comes to new medical breakthroughs. But when you're in it, you don't understand that you're setting the stage for every company that comes to market to have to think about what the government's going to do. And this rules of the road and the operating environment that government creates, particularly in healthcare, where almost 45% of Americans receive their healthcare through either government or heavily subsidized government program, mean, government has really reshaped the healthcare industry writ large over the last 20, 30 years.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of the interplay between government and industry, right? Because now you've sat on both sides of this of the coin, and we obviously at New York Bio have vested interests here. But can you talk to us a little bit about kind of that interplay and how companies should think about policy, and how perhaps the government should think about the ramifications of what they do as it pertains to both industry and patients, and all of the other things that make up this healthcare system?
Yeah, so being in government, you're in this like box of what is the authority I have to make a decision. And Congress gives government very clear authorities and the agencies for where they believe government has a role to play. But just recently I served at the White House, and that's a very different place in government. And at the White House, I know you all got to meet my good friend, Dr. Matt Hepburn, who I served under. The White House is a very different place in government, where the White House has not the ability to fund anything directly, because that really goes to the agencies, or to write laws and regulations, but it has the ability to set the agenda and set the tone from the top. So when you think about, just finishing out government, so you've got a tone setting, the ability to get attention on certain issues, just like we saw President Biden do to remind us that we have the possibility of curing cancer yesterday with the 60th anniversary of Moonshot, and announcing the first inaugural director of ARPA-H. That's just as important as the regulations and rules. So when you sit in the private sector, you also at GSK and then at Alexion, you have this mission, particularly in Alexion. We were very, very focused on the patient. You have a mission to bring a treatment to market for a patient. And that patient lives in the context of their country, their healthcare system, the government laws and regulations that will impact not only when they get diagnosed, but when they'll eventually, hopefully, get on your treatment, and then if they can stay on your treatment. So when you're operating in a heavily regulated organization, like any healthcare organization, having a really deep understanding of policy is critical. And policy for any healthcare organization just doesn't live within the policy team. It's manufacturing and what the FDA needs, right? It's your chief legal officer. It's if you buy or sell a company, it's what the FTC is going to approve. Policy is all over a company's organization. But what I will say is, one of the powerful roles of a policy team in any organization is not just to think about what the world looks like today, but what the world and the operating environment could look like in the future, and the types of laws and regulations that need to be advanced. And the real synergy that you see over and over, when we get it right, is when we all, whether you're in the government or whether you're in the industry, can focus on a set of shared goals, like what President Biden was trying to do with the cancer moonshot, and bring all of the power of the government to set the rules of the road in the right way to bear, but also bring the capital and the talent and the innovation of the industry to really run after those same shared goals.
So I think that's great. And it almost feels a little overwhelming, right? When you lay it out, right? You're like, okay, we have this agency and that agency, but Congress is going to pass an authorizing law anyway. And so think about, let's weave this back to your origin story. It also sounds like you were super linear, right? And I'm guessing it didn't feel very linear at the time as you made your way through, right, the different pieces. You went to government and you learned the policy, and you worked with patients, and you went to government, then you went to industry. If I'm a younger entrepreneur and starting a business, right? So I'm starting a therapeutics discovery company in New York. How did they think about it? Because they're thinking about their run rate, and are they going to validate their experiments, and are they de-risking like investors want them to? So how did they start thinking about engaging, and what policy is important to their patients down the road?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Jennifer, because when you're at GSK, you've been a company for 300 years. You operate at a global scale. You're going to be, hopefully, knock on wood, a company for the next 300 years. It's a very different environment than being at Alexion. And Alexion was a 25-year commercial company when I joined that already has a drug on the market. But if I'm an entrepreneur and I have this amazing idea, and my first focus is really trying to raise capital to bring that idea forward, there had to be something that inspired that entrepreneur. And hopefully it was more than just like, I see something promising here that'll lead to this. Hopefully it was a personal connection to wanting to make an impact on somebody's life, consumer's life, a decision maker if you're a B2B in a business, a patient for many of us that are in the biopharma industry. So immediately you narrow into what is it going to take to raise capital and to get that next step, right? That next clinical trial funded, and the clinical trial and the regulatory approval process. And for many small entrepreneurs, like, policy doesn't play a role. And in many ways, it is the distraction. I would always say for small biotech companies, sit through one workshop, half-day workshop a year on the policy environment, and you're good. And this, like, separate out the FDA environment. You better know FDA, and it better be part of your life from day one, understanding what the FDA is going to need from you. But the macro environment really, for most companies, and rightly so, doesn't come into play until they're starting to plan for their phase 3. And that's probably exactly right. You know, lots of people, I wouldn't say lots of people, but, you know, I would say I'm a hardcore policy person. I've overseen corporate affairs in Alexion. And sometimes small biotechs, founders and I will get really excited. And they'll come to me and be like, Tanisha, please join the company. And I'll say to them, you don't need me, right? Like, you're not going to be till you're like, you've built, if you have hired your chief commercial officer, then you need me, maybe after that.
Yeah.
But like, you have room to like wait to understand that broader environment, but not too long. And so I will say that relationship back to the macro policy environment changes as the company begins to mature.
Well, okay, just to play slight devil's advocate on this, though, if we think about the negotiation clause in the IRA, right? If that impacts valuations across the board, right? If that impacts what investors think your breakthrough is going to be worth in 15 years, that actually now becomes important. Although I could imagine if it's a binary event and it just changes the whole landscape, you could still say you don't have to worry about it. It is what it is. But, actually now, does that change things? Does that change how we broadly think about how we go after early stage innovation?
Before the IRA passed, you had a number of vocal biotech investors, Peter Kolchinsky, or maybe I got his name wrong, from and others that said the future of small molecules is dead, right? Because of the runway that small molecules will have, which is 13 years after they've had an FDA approval before they're subject to negotiation. I don't know. I think it's still early to tell. We just recently at Brunswick took a look at what the sell side analysts were saying about the impact of IRA. Basically, across the board, it was a nothing burger for them, right? Many of the sell side analysts, let me pull this, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Credit Suisse all said, we think this is going to be a marginally impactful event. So I think there's more to see in terms of whether the early money decides to change the way it invests. And, every sign pre the passage of IRA said that was going to be the case. For companies that are still raising money, I talked to a few over the weekend, they are concerned. I think for them, they feel like there's more pressure for them to hit the ground commercially. And they don't know whether and how the IRA is going to impact M&A behavior, right? So for small biotechs, they, very few of them think that they're going to be in the market 9 to 10 years after launch.
Right.
So how does that really impact the M&A behavior of their potential future acquirer? And I think those are outstanding questions that we have yet to see what will happen.
Yeah, I really think we have a tale of instead of two cities, it's sort of two stages, right? And I think a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act was already priced in for public companies. I think it's long been priced in, given the conversations we've had over the last 2 years at the federal level. But I think exactly what you're saying, and we don't know yet, is the impact of preclinical and pre-public companies.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think, and I think one of the areas that most concerns me, that I think many analysts and policy analysts I've spoken to have voiced, is that once you have an FDA approval of a new molecular entity, like the incentives to look at the next set of indications that drug could benefit, or a different mode of administration that's better for a patient, those are definitely going to get impacted. And how companies think about sort of that cycle of innovation for drugs is definitely going to be impacted. And for those of us, I know Derek knows my passion for how do we get the full potential of science of an asset to market, and ideas of repurposing and shelved assets. Like it really does create sort of a question of how do we do that, right? When we know that there can be additional potential uses for a drug on the market.
Well, okay, so let's go there, right? I think one of the things that our industry has shown that we're really good at is I think we're genuinely good at responding to external stresses, right? If you look about the way that the industry responded during the pandemic, it was really pretty clear, where we said, okay, this is the way we did things before. This is where the guide rails are. This is the way we think we can do it now, and this is the way we're going to go do it. And out of that, comes whatever comes. But usually, we're pretty good at responding to things like changes in the way that capital is deployed, changes in what the macro funding structures look like. And I think if we wind the clock back, probably somewhere between about 5 and 8 years, I think that was when we started to see deals like SpringWorks and things like that going, that gave a little more credence to the fact that repurposing and kind of getting the most out of these assets could actually be done. I know for a long time there was no incentive for larger biopharma companies to do it. In fact, I had multiple discussions with biz dev people saying basically it's a dead issue. I get no credit for any of this. There's no point in us doing it. And I think that environment has changed. So at least now that it's an option, I think we can probably find ways to do it. I think it just takes a lot of willing participants.
I would agree. And I definitely think that we have some great proof points like a SpringWorks that are out there, right? And that continues to be a positive development. What is harder though is, having been on the company side, it's still a matter of, a choice between finding an asset that is focused in your core areas that the business development team is being tasked to find and to do all the paperwork and all the diligence and all the internal meetings that goes along with it, much less interacting with the partners and financing, versus like deprioritizing an asset that the teams have already said don't mean much. And they'll put an effort out there, of course they will, but there's a time lapse that like 2 years, we're done trying to find a commercial partner. So there's still cases where, shelved assets stay on the shelf because they're just not a strategic fit and the teams just run out of time.
Yep.
For once that happens, then companies know that there's value here, but there has not been historically an easy way to take those assets and try to donate them out. And that's something that, there are some emerging models for donation that are really can be appealing to the industry. But I do think that even with that, with the IRA and the incentives, back to your question, yes, we do really good responding to incentives, but that is in sometimes disconnected to where there's still need. Antibiotics are a perfect example of that. The public health need is clear. The financial incentives have not been great, right? No. So we've seen companies launch drugs and fail, right? So I do think that we're early days to see whether for some development programs, those smaller populations that they were going to initially go to market with are going to still be the same strategy, right? Or whether they, take a look at what the new IRA provisions create and say, we've got to at least enter the market in a bigger cancer, in a bigger indication.
Yeah.
And so for those patients, I had this very heated discussion with a colleague, and I was like, for those patients, like, that's who suffers. And for me, I think Wall Street has an outlook that will probably turn out to be perfectly fine. For them, they'll get the returns.
Right.
Companies will adjust, right? But what's left is, like, where were the drugs for these smaller patient populations?
Right.
They may never see them.
Right. The financial returns do not track, did this drug get to all the patients that it could have helped? Right.
That's
and,
right.
I think one of the big things here is that through philanthropy and through kind of these organizations that are empowering, patients and bringing the patient voice into the equation, I think we now have a much stronger advocacy environment to kind of provide some of that purpose and that motivation. I think there, with so many outlets for different patient groups to find a voice, and actually with different financing structures starting to come on board, I think there's a lot more people that have a voice that say, we see there's a path here,
yeah,
and they're going to actually go after it. And I think that's a really, really healthy aspect of the entire bioscience industry, that, if you have a voice and if you actually can push the scientific thesis, you can actually make this progress that can help get drugs to patients.
Yeah, I mean, Derek, you touched on exactly the reason why, for me, if from the moment, I left Aid Atlanta, understood the power of the nonprofit community, and have remained active in the nonprofit community throughout my career. And I'll say that, it's the philanthropic sector plays an enormous role. We always look at the philanthropic sector in terms of the percentage of a very small percentage. I think the last thing I saw was less than 10% of medical research is funded through philanthropy, right? So it's a very small part of the capital structure of biomedical research. But what it does do, Derek, to your point, is it brings focus and urgency to a problem. And sometimes, I don't know how many expert groups I've been on. Like the last expert group where this was the punchline was the future of vaccines, vaccine science and policy with the Aspen Institute and Sabin. And we were looking at universal flu. And in that case, you had all these amazing people around the table. And what they said is, we have all these core capabilities. We have government with these programs, we've got philanthropy, we've got, the companies that could do the science. We just don't have anybody conducting an orchestra. And inevitably, like, that's the issue, is who is there to say, this is the problem, this is the bold ambition that all of us should have that are scattered in different sectors and all over the world, and who holds them accountable for getting it done. That is a very, very large task that we're asking philanthropy to play.
Yeah.
And philanthropy is, the nonprofits struggle, right? Who funds nonprofits, right? They don't get a big check from the government oftentimes. And so, like, this is the most fragile, but the most critical sector in terms of the three sectors that have to all work together to actually achieve the kinds of goals. I want to pause on this. So I'm in California because I'm on the board of One Mind, which has been an amazing organization since the mid-90s, focused on what was not a super popular topic back then, which was mental health.
Yeah.
And being able to sit back as a board member and listen to the legacy of One Mind and what's been accomplished, what was inspired by a deeply personal family story, and sort of the science they've developed, the community they've built. But during the weekend, we had an amazing keynote by Regina Dugan from Welcome Leap. Mm-hmm. And I've been under a rock for 2 years, I will say it, but it's the first time I listened to her and what Welcome Leap is trying to accomplish. It was these moments that, like, I'm like chills, like tears and chills. Like, Welcome Leap has already started, in 2 years she's been there, has put out 5 programs and spent $350 million
Wow.
to create bold goals, to think about totally unconventional ways to approach them, to take the DARPA model that you ran in the US government and to apply it to human health. And it was exactly what we're saying about the role of philanthropy, that urgency, the willingness to take risks and do bold things, and a different way of working across the ecosystem. So I will say every one of us should keep an eye on what Brigitte and that team's doing.
Yep, I just put the Welcome Leap link in the chat, and I think one of the things that it's interesting. So they deployed that much capital. That's amazing.
2 years. Their programs are funded at $50 to $60 million a piece.
Usually, what philanthropy is good at, or the role it can kind of fill, is getting more kind of 0 to 1 assets, right? Getting assets to the point where someone, do you have? It's the classic thing where as a discovery company, the first question is like, okay, what do you have going into the clinic? There are these touch points where below which no one will look at these programs. And if you get above those, then yeah, you have a clinical asset, then people will start to become interested because you've gotten to the right stage. And I think what's interesting about the Welcome Leap piece is when you have the capital to take the asset forward because it's good, and not because of any of the other external factors that need to go into a deal conversation, that's really, really powerful, right? Because then you get to the point where that asset's going to be judged. You get to the point where you have proof points on the science, you get in human safety and efficacy, and you start to get these things that everyone will pay attention to. Before you have them, it's all speculation and everyone can have their own opinion, but once you have them, they're pretty immutable.
Yeah, I mean, she made a great point that they don't do grants, it's all contracts, right? Because it's working with performers. Instead of calling them investigators, they're performers to achieve very specific goals. And the other thing that just struck me when you guys dig into LEAP is they have 70 organizations funded across the world and 650 researchers, and they're working across the world. So they have strong relationships with China, strong relationships in the Middle East, strong relationships in areas where the US's geopolitical dynamics may make things harder and harder to collaborate in the same way.
Yep.
So I just left that presentation just blown away at what she and Welcome Leap and that team is really trying to do moving forward.
Yeah.
I mean, ironically contrasted with, we've just launched our ARPA-H for the US. So you're going to have, unfortunately, there are going to be lots of head-to-head comparisons because they're, starting almost at the same time with very similar goals.
That's what I was going to say. Do you think there is a right way to do it, for like private philanthropy versus government? Is there a hybrid model that actually we think is going to be the most successful in reaching patients? What do you think the right avenue is?
I think it's all, not an easy answer. I think it's all of the above.
Yeah.
I referenced that I had left the White House this May, and if I know Matt's come to talk to the community here, and being at that level and having no budget, right? You have no budget, you have soft power. It's all soft power. But the one thing I'll say is that, one of the shocking things I learned in the White House around pandemic preparedness was there's no one agreement as to the source of truth for what's actually emerging, right? So what is it that we're all trying to shoot at as it relates to an emerging biological threat, and how quickly we or even in government can agree to that? So if you can't start with the premise that we have a problem, that we have this many people with diabetes, that we have this rare disease that doesn't have any treatment, then that's really difficult to get everybody on. And the second thing I learned, which I think that the White House is actually really trying to start to address, is there's no single scientific agenda, right? So even if you say, all right, we see this, it's coming, then who takes stock and says, we're going to need this type of technological innovation in this many years? Where are we doing this in the NIH? Where are we doing this through BARDA? Where do all of our chips sit? And do we even agree that that's the technological innovation we need? So you just saw recently the White House put out a research agenda on monkeypox. They just put out their progress report on AP3. And it looks very bureaucratic. You're like, what is research agenda? Really? It was like, what? I had a reporter call me. They're like, how am I supposed to report on this? It is maybe not the sexiest story to tell, but just the explicit act of saying this is a research agenda that comes from this part of government is actually a big deal.
Right. Yeah, something government looking government,
Right.
What?
But like it's important for government to talk to government, but even more importantly, if you're an entrepreneur out there and the government says we need X and we're really willing to stake future funding on this, that's hopefully de-risk it for you in terms of pursuing areas that you're seeing a clear signal.
Right. And one thing that we saw, so when Dr. Matt Hepburn was here talking with us on this breakfast, as well as with our manufacturing summit, one thing he was stressing is the desire for the White House in particular, to learn more about manufacturing within the US and looking for partnerships, right? And ways to collaborate, which I think is great that they are going, they're in addition to putting out their plan, and voluminous as it may be, they're also going out, right? They're putting boots on the ground and in the field to work with entrepreneurs, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah,
that's right. I mean, I think that, I think I think on a personal basis, he is so good at understanding that innovation doesn't happen in the walls of government. You got to get out there and look and, visit the communities like North Carolina, like Maryland. I know they're out in Seattle this week. Like they want to get out there. I know they've been to New York and see what people are doing, but it really does take sort of really a lot of conversation between government and private industry to have even a shared language, understanding of different expectations that they're living under. And, frankly, there's not many people that have worked deeply in government, worked deeply in the private sector, and worked deeply in philanthropy. So, like, I find myself a little bit of an oddball in having worked in all three sectors. But I did it because I kept feeling a lot of, when Derek and I talk about sort of life journey, I shouldn't say this because I think I would not say this is imposter syndrome. I will just put this out there. But I get to the point where I'm like, I don't know enough about like how this actually works. And I want to go over and like get another view of the same problem.
Yeah.
And, luckily I've been able to do that in places that have really given me a lot of humility for what I don't know, and given me some important lessons to learn to take with me to the next step. But there's never a shortcut to really immersing yourself in all the different ways that a problem really does present itself.
Yeah.
Well, I was just saying, and at the end of the day, you are living proof that we need expertise and cooperation across all of these modalities in order to really accelerate and reach patients with cures and treatments.
It's true. And I want to say, having gone through a number of these different leaks, that the people who stay in it, like some of your members, like Annette Backer from CTF, are just so in it. Like the day-to-day of being that person trying to orchestrate this macro environment that, more days than not doesn't want to hear from you, right? Mm-hmm. It is emotionally difficult and hard work. And when you meet those people, just take a pause and say thank you, because it's hard. And the people that stay in it are amazing. And I will say, like, I for one had to have a little bit of a breather during the pandemic, because like between the pandemic and the overwhelmingness of just being the person who wants to be a conductor, it is definitely draining.
Yeah, it's funny, there's a lot of these people in our industry, right? I find this to be one of the most interesting things, and it's a weird dichotomy. You meet these people, and as you're talking to them, you realize you're like, man, the depth that this person has and whatever they're doing. You mentioned universal flu before, which just anybody that's been in universal flu, you think about all of these things, but you see these people that you're like, man, they get every in and out of here. They've done this for a decade. And even with that person doing it, like, it's not, there is no easy, so there's no quick win, there's no simple solution or anything. Because even you meet these people and you're like, well, that person 10 times as good as I could ever be, and I have thoughts, and this person is still doing it, and it's not fixed yet. Gosh, it must be really, really hard, you know. And you realize just how complicated and difficult a lot of what we're trying to do is, which is one of the reasons that you get to either a welcome leap or hopefully an ARPA-H that will turn around and say, you know what, we're going to do this differently. Like, we understand all of the ways that these things work over here, and we get the way that you're going to do it. So we're going to tweak that, and we're going to take our $1 billion and we're going to do it this way. And hopefully this way actually leads to some breakthroughs that all of this capital and this infrastructure hasn't given us yet.
Yeah. But I will say, like, one of the, and I'm sure there's been a lot written about this, but you know, already ARPA-H or welcome leave, like they have to so deeply understand the role they play in this macro context, right? And you know, you've seen all the criticism. So if ARPA-H going into cancer, there's a lot of debate. Like, we got a huge amount of capital talent going into cancer.
Right? Do we need more?
You have lots of people saying, but what about us, right? Like, there's no capital here. There's no focus here. Right? There are incentives that are stacked against us for anybody to like focus on these particular patients. And so 100%, like what they're doing within their four walls is so critical to get right. And I would say this for every organization, but particularly for philanthropic organizations like a Welcome Leap or an ARPA. But if they lose sight of where capital, talent, and focus outside of their organization is going or not going, then their work is even can have more impact. If they can keep an eye on where there are, and I love to call them innovation deserts out there, like that, or where there is technological breakthrough that will enable so many more areas to move forward, like that to me is such a sweet spot.
Yeah. So I want to take your imposter syndrome and throw it out the window for a minute and talk a little bit about what you, well, you know, I want to talk about what you bring to the Brunswick group, right? Because it's, I love the fact that you stepped into this position and you take all of the experience that you have in, you know, being on kind of both sides of the coin and seeing things from a whole bunch of different angles. And now you're in a position to, you know, actually really take complex problems that people are dealing with and, you know, give them perhaps, you know, angles on the solution they haven't thought of before.
Yeah. So I will say, so it came out of Alexion. I was like, I'm gonna be on the beach for a year. Literally, I was like, I want to be on the beach for a year. And then Matt Hepburn at Thanksgiving, 6 months in, comes calling, and he's like, you really have no experience. He had the most appealing offer. I want you to work a lot, and I'm not going to pay you a cent.
You know.
And then, of course, he's like, and you guys have met him, so you get it. And then he's like, but it's time for you to join the mission. You really have no excuse.
Yeah.
And he was right. And when
you remember, we had this conversation, and you're like, I don't think I can do it. And my brain is like, oh yeah, she's definitely going to do it.
So like, I gave him a real big Annie. I was like, if you can get my security clearance done in 3 weeks, I'll go. I was like, there's no way he's going to do it. Touristic of me, I had already planned 2 really big vacations. So I was like, all right, if you can fit in between my vacations, I will come work for the White House. But it all worked out. But one of the things that really for me was profound on a personal level was I was not in charge. Like, I was not in charge. I was there to support a leader who I believed in and in a cause that I believed in. And for this time of my life, like, I loved it, right? I loved being the person who brought a certain set of skills to a team. And it has been, it's been a long time. So I'm used to being sort of the nose on an organization. Mm-hmm. And so when I came out of that, I thought to myself, like, one of the areas of pure joy I've had in my career was in my early days at Avalere Health, where Avalere was like on the cutting edge of working with anybody who didn't understand government, didn't understand Part D, and why Medicare was going to like blow their minds as a drug company. So, and I loved it. I loved the ability to help lots of different people on issues that were really big for them, transformative for them. And so fast forward to Brunswick. So along the way, I've been talking, Brunswick if we could do a raise of hands, I would do it. And you would see that like maybe 2 or 3 people out of 60 people know Brunswick. So Brunswick is a privately held company. We've actually been in business for the last 30 years. We're actually not even small. We're about 2,000 people spread across the world.
Oh, wow, that's big.
19 countries, I think 22 offices. I probably don't have that right, but lots of global footprint. But we were founded by, our founders are still very active in the business. Like we were founded as a company that was going to be there when a organization, we don't work for individuals or government, but where companies had a bet your company moment. Like it was just all in, we're all in, right? All in. So those were big M&A, we're going to IPO, we're being sued, right? Like we are at sort of a reputational risk. So like Brunswick is one of my friends called us a deep carpet firm. So when I came out of the White House, I was like, who are the people that I've met in the last 2 years that have blown my mind impressive? And when I tallied it up, it was all my colleagues at Brunswick. Like they come from, so that cybersecurity expert, our CEO was the Deputy Secretary of Treasury under Obama. Like just these amazing, my buddy that I started with was a former ambassador. He was involved in sort of negotiating with Northern Ireland. Like I have just found myself very luckily surrounded by really people who inspire me, people who want to work on critical matters that matter to our clients. And the other thing that I have had now a very deep appreciation for, which is why Brunswick for me was, everybody can have a great idea. You could even have all of the money to like move that idea forward. But if you cannot articulate the relevance of your idea to others, particularly not just to the public, but to your investors and government, it doesn't move forward. So despite all of my sort of functional expertise in corporate affairs, communications remained one of the areas where I was like super curious to learn from the masters. Like, what is this? If I say it a different way, is the outcome going to change, right? Like, I secretly believe that's like a superpower we should all get better at, particularly in the age of digital and social media and how polarized and how language has become even more important. I couldn't think of spending better time than learning from masters at Brunswick and getting to work with as many people as I want to work with on issues that matter to them. So, yes, that's why I'm here. I'm super excited to be here. I'm 2 months in, so I've still got that honeymoon glow.
Glow.
And if you have a bet your company moment, I'm your gal.
I know. I used to joke with a previous executive at Merck, where I worked for a long time, and at GSK before that, that you actually didn't want to see me coming because it usually meant something had blown up.
That's right.
So you're saying we do want to see you coming, Tanisha.
We want to see you coming before a blow up. But yeah,
exactly.
I mean, unfortunately, it's human behavior. Until you're really in trouble, you don't look around and be like, who else did I need on this team? Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, right? Because you have the realization that you're at a bet the company moment needs to filter to the right people to say, hey, we're at a bet the company moment. And it can't just be one person 3 levels down that looks around and is like, this is not good, people. It's like, I don't know if you guys can see the third chess move from here, but once that pawn moves to that square, we are in trouble, people.
Right.
So, but it's interesting. How does that conversation go, right? Does someone literally have to come to you guys and say, we recognize, the first step of the problem is recognizing there's a problem, right? And that's kind of a hard step. So are people pretty good at recognizing that?
I've only been here for 2 months, and the organization is amazingly, it's got so many dimensions to it. But in my observation, like I think most of our businesses over the years is word of mouth, right? It's somebody got in trouble or somebody is having a big moment. It goes well. They work with Brunswick. They tell their other board members, CEOs. And oftentimes, like I've personally found a lot of it is just picking up the phone when the phone rings.
Yeah.
Not every organization can be so blessed to have more incoming than they can handle. But unfortunately, in our world, there are more bet the company moments than you could ever imagine, because now it's bet the company moments to like figure out whether or not you're going to go out there and talk about dogs, right? So like the world of business and the public and perceptions of your organization and its impact to investors and the government, it's all so fast and furious right now.
Yeah. Well, and don't you think that there are, I mean, like in any life cycle of a company, right? Like you have things that you can see down the road, like you will run out of money. You will, I mean, there are things you can see. And then there are other things that are largely impacted by external forces, government decisions that you don't expect, market activity that you didn't expect. And then, so it's a confluence, right, of external forces and things you could have foreseen.
100%. Or like even things that may not have been sort of an external trigger, but you know, all of us have been talking about patient centricity for how long? And part of the lesson learned isn't just, of course, not just talking about it, but like how do you change culture around it? So like, you know, some clients come to us and say, we have like a cultural internal campaign we want to run on like how do we think about health equity or DEI or patient centricity, which is near and dear to my heart. And those are just as urgent for them as, oh my goodness, we may be, you know, subject to some legal violation and might get sued, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because it's just as important from an internal perspective to make sure your teams are doing their best and reaching toward the ultimate goal, you know, as it is to make sure you can literally stay in business.
Those are definitely are more progressed, and I would say like they're really looking around that corner the way you want them to.
Yeah. Yes. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up culture too, because it's funny. You usually have, you know, one person in an organization that gets all the press release headlines, but there's, you know, legions of people below them that actually make, you know, this business is driven by people. And you realize very quickly when you run into people from X or Y organization that there are a lot of good people that are actually, you know, moving things forward and making the gears turn. And, you know, thinking about how we think about teams and how we think about culture internally is super, super important. Because if all you did was read the market press releases and read doom and gloom, and you know, I think we're still only ranked slightly above tobacco in terms of you know, good industries to work for, or public perception of the industry. You know, there's a lot to deal with in trying to do this kind of science. So it's a dichotomy of what does the public think of what you do for your job versus what are you trying to do for patients at the end of the day. It's kind of a hard thing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think there's a lot of soul searching in the industry after IRA, and not because of the specific provisions, but what it signaled in terms of how much the public understands the all of what goes into innovation decisions and all of sort of the risks that the companies take on. I was just reviewing some polling data, and even last fall, you only had 5% of the American public in this poll say that they believe the industry when they say that if you spend less money on like if cuts went through, that it would impact innovation. I'm like, whoa, this is like fundamental accounting that we've missed on, right? Like where, you know, like where are we as an industry? Is it because we weren't specific enough on what kind of innovation? Is it because we're not sure, like people were so willing to trade something off that they didn't think was going to impact their lives, and it was too far of a trade-off that they could care about? Like these are all very good questions for how we continue to talk about the value of the industry.
Well, I think the communication of how our industry works could be better. I mean, I realize it's complicated, but it's very, the public's mind probably has, you know, a straight line drawn from, you know, the NIH through to a large biopharma company when, you know, a basic science thing gets done, and they miss the intermediaries of the entrepreneurs in venture capital and tech transfer and kind of the stages of capital and all of the little things that have to happen correctly before it goes anywhere near a patient. And, you know, disrupting, you know, a piece of that, we'll call it a supply chain, you disrupt a piece of that and the rest of it, you know, the rest of it has to adjust. But each one of them has, kind of disparate business goals, right? The good example here is, Barbara Dalton runs Pfizer's venture fund. And if their fund returned, if their fund tripled every year, it probably wouldn't make that big of a dent in the end of year earnings for Pfizer, right? It doesn't have the same impact that a larger company looks for, or where Wall Street incentivizes them to be. So the actual ecosystem is potentially more fragile than we think about, because it's not a continuum.
I mean, we see it, right? We talked about
Yeah.
AMR. I mean, up until recently, mental health was an innovation desert.
Right.
So like,
Yeah.
we know that and if you're a rare disease patient, like you feel it every day, that you hear all the time, like science is at light speed, we're at the platinum age of science, and all of a sudden your child is sick and nobody knows how to diagnose them, or much less like they get diagnosed and there's nothing there for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, so I mean, I think that the scariest thing I feel for the future is that all of the, everybody's status quo will remain in terms of sort of returns on investment, profitability. But what really does happen to patients who aren't going to get these cures, and how do we tell that story differently moving forward?
Right.
And hopefully, I was talking to somebody who's very positive about the IRA, and I asked this question. I was like, what happens? Like, legitimately, these companies will make very rational decisions, and so they should.
Mhm.
What happens if they decide not to pursue a research program in a rare disease? And they said, well, surely government will make up for that. And I just wanted to, I was like, oh my God, I just want to crawl in the hole, right?
Yeah.
Like the attitude is, of course, government will be there. And huge supporter of government. I've been in government twice, right? Like, and I want to believe that to be the case. I don't think any of us think that's actually true.
Your opinion is both inspiring and infuriating at the same time.
We have a long ways to go.
Yeah.
And I do think there is a disconnect when you talk to people that say that, well, government will pick up the slack, but then you look at other countries that have a largely government-run healthcare system, and you look at the delays their residents have, their citizens have of receiving care, receiving innovative therapies, but there is a disconnect, right? It's like, okay, I see that, but I don't really believe it.
Yeah.
And right.
And I mean, and government
a lot you can do about that.
Right?
Yeah.
It's going to spend $1 on trying to actually treat somebody with what exists today versus spend $1 that may or may not lead to a new innovation in the future. Yeah. That's a super rational choice government's making.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But it is interesting when you talk to people here who have had pretty wide open access, right, to cures as they are developed. And I just think they don't actually believe that it will change. But
they have not traveled enough to understand that there are patients in very wealthy countries that don't have the same choices we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I don't want it to have to get there for us, for people to realize, right? Like, we don't want it to have to be like that in the US in order for people to say, oh, wait, there is value in the innovation that occurs in the private sector.
It's so funny that you raised this, Jennifer, because we're working on this idea of global campaign around a focused in like the world of cancer, right? And if you start talking about if at a global level, if you start talking about sort of the new technologies that we see from a diagnostic perspective, super excited to see Grail's outcomes data yesterday, right?
Yeah.
And like we're talking about what we see, and then I think to myself, if this is going to be global, like Brazil doesn't have the things that we had 10 years ago. So like that to me was such like how do you, like, if you start even saying this is what some countries have, I would say like there are people all over the world that don't realize that science actually exists.
Yeah.
And then where does that put these governments, right? In terms of having to up the ante in terms of what's available.
I think globally, the wheel of implementation is slow, right? It happens, but it's slow. And we're lucky in a lot of ways to be in a place where, it may not be perfect, but when the new thing hits, here is where it hits first, usually, right? And we do the work of basically figuring out how it's going to work. How do we get to the first 100 patients? How do we treat the first 1,000 patients? You know, oh no, no one's going to be able to pay for this. Well, how do we actually get things paid for? We do a lot of that. And, you know, there's, you know, both costs and benefits to it, but here is really where it happens first, which is, you know, both challenging, exciting, and everything. And, you know, again, I go back to kind of the welcome leaps and the ARPA-H and thinking about new ways of doing things. The nice part about this environment is that we have the ability to find new ways of doing things. And I think a lot of that is, you know, what's going to be necessary over the next 10 years, even if you just think about sequencing, CRISPR, and all of these new things that, you know, how do you ultimately, the thing that brings them together is, how do we do what's best for patients? How do we actually get to the thing where people can get the newest science and actually we can treat as many people as possible? And that
I hear you. And I think that, you know, in our last few minutes, I don't think science will be our problem. I think we will have ample innovation and great ideas to move forward. I think our challenge will be how to connect that dot so that the obstacles that will exist hopefully are recognized and we're able to move through. But yes, and I know we've talked a bunch, and I don't know if there were any questions, but I'm always happy to take questions offline as well.
Great. Yes, that is a yes, we've had a request, and I think Derek put your the Brunswick website, right? There we go. The Brunswick group website in the chat. I know we are almost out of time. So Tanisha, thank you. You get extra credit for joining us from the West Coast. The 3-hour time difference garners an extra level of respect this morning. So really, thank you. This conversation was fantastic. I think we could have kept going for another hour, but we will let you go. Everyone, we appreciate you joining us today, and we hope to see you next week at our virtual breakfast and at the annual meeting the week after. Thanks, Tanisha.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.